All right, so I've done a little bit of skimming and a little bit of thinking, and I've come to a few preliminary conclusions about the revenue generation topic. And the first of these is that this is, not a hopeless term, but it's a term that does have some shortcomings. Revenue generation is not a term where you're going to find a lot of references where the United States federal government is talking about its own operations and calling them revenue generation policies. I did find a fair number of references. The government of Nigeria talks about its revenue generation. The government of Pakistan talks about its revenue generation. And there are a number of universities, when they talk about their athletic teams, they'll say, well, this one's a revenue generating program. Sometimes states will use the term revenue generation. There are Native American nations talking about revenue generation. But the United States, for whatever reason, whether it's the Treasury, whether it's the Internal Revenue Service, it doesn't seem as though revenue generation comes up all that often in those discussions. So you'll find sort of loose discussions of the topic, and they talk about taxes and tariffs and fees, and they almost always include a reference to and other sources of income, which means effectively almost anything that comes in that is income is revenue generation. Now, one thing I think we can rule out right away, you'll find it's easy to find definitions of revenue that from business and investment dictionaries and glossaries that say it's only revenue if it doesn't create a new liability. In other words, it's only revenue if you don't have to pay it back. And I've seen a couple of preliminary topic analyses on this topic that include things like borrowing money from China, selling bonds, and so forth. I think you can eliminate those. I don't think those are topical because I don't think that's revenue. I think we use it, it's cash flow to run the government, but I think that negatives would have a pretty easy time saying that's not revenue because we do have to pay it back. The fact that we have to go and we have to collect tax dollars or we have to go and collect fees and things of that nature to pay back the holders of the bonds, that's why those aren't revenue. So I think you can keep that in mind, and that's something that you don't necessarily have to deal with. Now, one of the things that's especially slippery is a lot of the discussions of revenue generation. What they're talking about is they're talking about the purpose of a policy. So you'll find people disagreeing. You'll find a fair amount of controversy a lot of times. There'll be a state that has a gasoline tax, and there'll be disagreement. Is the purpose of that gasoline tax to get people to burn less gasoline, to get them to drive less and take mass transit more often? Or is its purpose revenue generation? There'll be a city that's putting on a big enforcement push, writing a lot of speeding tickets. And are those speeding tickets, is their purpose to try to get people to slow down, or is their purpose revenue generation? So you might have an argument in store as the negative, although I think it would be kind of a hard argument to win, that the way you judge revenue generation is by the purpose that the policy, the affirmative, is changing. What is its purpose? Does it have a secondary purpose like income distribution, like economic stimulus? Because if any of those are its primary purpose, then it's not really a revenue generation policy. And you'll find enough people talking about, well, this is not revenue generation, this is something else, that you could construct that argument. But I think that affirmatives would have a fairly easy time saying, well, we say what the purpose of our plan is. Our plan is the reform of revenue generation. And how negatives could ever get far enough away from that to say, well, here's an objective test, I don't know. But it turns up enough that you probably want to be aware of it. One other wrinkle that I like a lot, because it turns up in the state of Texas, which is my home state. Texas has, I don't remember whether it's written into the state's code or whether it's in the Constitution, but they will not let incoming funds be called revenue if they're already earmarked for a particular purpose. One example I can give is the Texas Lottery. When the Texas Lottery was created, it was written into the law that all proceeds from the lottery were supposed to go to education. Now, since then, that's been changed, I believe. But at the time, there were a number of state court decisions that said that the money collected for selling lottery tickets was not revenue, because that money already had a purpose. That money could already be treated as spent. So it could be the case that with some of the possible outlier affirmatives that teams might get daring enough to try, that you on the negative might be able to apply the Texas test and say if this is earmarked money, then it's not revenue. It's only revenue if it goes into big pots that can be used for any governmental purpose or just for deficit reduction. With that in mind, What I was able to find, I went to the website where they have archived the United States budget from years past, and there's an Excel spreadsheet that you can download that lists all the different receipts, all the different incoming sources, incoming pots of money that the federal government has. And you can get some pretty good ideas for affirmatives from these. And just looking at a line item doesn't tell you whether there's literature, whether there are people who advocate making any particular changes. But there are a few I spotted where I think you will have an easy time finding harm, finding solvency, finding phrasing for what the plan should say. So I want to call your attention to those. The first of them is civil asset forfeiture. If a federal law enforcement agency is investigating you for certain crimes, they can seize your property. If they think that you've been using your car to make deliveries of drugs, they can take your car, and they can then auction the car off and keep the money. And there are actually a fair number of horror stories going around because the standard of proof they have to meet in order to do a forfeiture and auction is actually fairly low. And I saw law review articles as recently as 2008 saying that those laws need to change. So if you were to go looking, if you were to pick civil asset forfeiture as your affirmative, it would be just a little bit off kilter from the affirmatives a lot of people are going to choose about tax reform, consumption taxes, flat taxes, and so forth, that you would have a tight little affirmative that was easy to defend that I think a lot of people's prepared negative strategies really wouldn't apply to. And some of that stuff can get kind of compelling. I mean, just cases of mistaken identity and people losing property that they've worked all their life for. I think you could fly under the radar with that affirmative a fair amount. A second sort of clump of affirmatives is almost anything that the federal government holds in trust but can give away the rights to make money off of. So this includes federal land, because the federal government can give out the rights to cut down trees on the land, to forest the land. It can give out the rights to graze cattle. It can give out the rights for mineral extraction, for oil drilling and coal mining. And in particular, there's a lot written about offshore oil drilling. All of those are sources of revenue, because all of those have to be paid for. So it might be topical for you to say that you're going to change how offshore oil drilling is permitted, because that's a change in a revenue generation policy. It's also possible, and as a matter of fact, I've seen a fair amount of pretty good evidence saying that this change ought to take place. The Federal Communication Commission owns the broadcast spectrum in the United States, but holds it in trust. And so therefore, broadcast TV stations and broadcast radio stations, they have to participate in an auction. The FCC auctions off part of the bandwidth. So anytime you're listening to your favorite radio station, they broadcast at that wavelength because they won the auction for that portion of the spectrum. And there's actually a bipartisan bill that's been proposed. I think it was introduced as recently as March of this year. Kay Bailey Hutchison was one of the sponsors, and from memory, I think Jay Rockefeller was another. That he may have introduced his own bill separate from hers. But what they talk about is that they should change that process to where instead of it just being a straightforward auction, that there should be incentives put in place for some of the people who have the most desirable parts of the spectrum to make it available to internet service providers for wireless broadband. And the term, if you want to look for that, the term is beachfront property. Whether it's because they're trying to be funny, clever, or just what, they talk about that part of the spectrum as the beachfront property. And the people who currently have the rights to it, they're not really getting that much use out of it anymore because the old broadcast purposes are becoming more and more obsolete. And if it could be turned over for broadcast, for wireless broadband, then a lot more people could have access to high-speed internet all over the country. And there are all kinds of advantages you can claim from that. That proposal is uncontroversial enough that I've seen it written about in a couple of places as just absolutely a no-brainer. It's just that there are a few fairly effective lobbyists for a couple of business interests that had something to lose that are throwing roadblocks in its way. But if you go and look for that, because the FCC auction is involved, I think you could say that that's a reform of a revenue generation policy. A couple of other possibilities. One other thing that you could do along the lines of you can change how fines are collected. You can't necessarily change the crime itself. I think probably that would be going too far out to still be topical. But one thing that comes up as a controversy every couple of years is how the FCC treats very minor, unexpected profanities. So, maybe you have a live TV show. This commonly happens with awards shows. And let's say it's the Grammys, and you have a rock musician come up to accept their award and let the F word slip out. And the FCC, when they impose the fine, they do so in a really unpredictable fashion. It almost seems as though they wait to see how much outrage will be generated by the incident, and then they set the fine, which is no way to set a fine. How unhappy were people? That's not how any sort of government's punishment for a violation of the law ought to happen. It ought to be independent of people's outrage, goes the argument. So what you might be able to do is see if there is a proposed reform for how the FCC ought to set fines for those, because the collection of the fine, the setting of the level of the fine, all of that is revenue generation. Because the funds come in, they go into the pot, they are used for enforcement purposes of the FCC. Nice little topical affirmative, and it would be interesting to see what the disadvantaged links would be to that, what offensive arguments would be available to the negative. Right off the top of my head, I find it hard to really think of any. The last one, I saw a fair number, this is really a twist on the topic, I saw a fair number of mentions of the phrase revenue generation in connection with complaints about unfunded mandates. Now, unfunded mandates, that's a states' rights question, and so you can get into the whole federalism debate. The federal government will pass laws requiring states to do this or do that, and what they require of states is actually going to be quite expensive, and then the federal government doesn't provide them any money at all, and that's a burden on states' rights. Well, sort of a second layer of unfunded mandate is placing limitations on what different ways the states can generate their own revenue. For the federal government to say certain ways of generating revenue are impermissible. So if you go do a little original research, look for unfunded mandate in the same place as revenue generation, and you might find a really slick little affirmative. The wrinkle here is that the federal government, it's not talking about federal funds, it's not talking about federal taxes, it's talking about state taxes and local taxes, but it's the federal policy. And the phrasing of the topic, you might recall, is for the federal government to reform its policies regarding revenue generation. But the construction of that sentence does not make it clear enough that the revenue generation itself has to be federal. That if you were to reform whether the federal government can place limits on states generating their own revenue, then a lot of the disadvantage links talking about federal tax, the federal budget, might be completely inapplicable to a completely topical affirmative. And a states' rights advantage, you can get some pretty good, pretty affirmative favored debate going. So let me talk a little bit about negative strategies. And I've seen the comment made a couple of other places, and I think this is true, that the strategies are going to need to be, if not affirmative specific, then at least specific to different areas of affirmatives. There may be a lot of different variations on tax simplification, and you may need to have a strategy for what happens with the tax simplification affirmatives, because there just aren't that many that are going to be broad spectrum. Political disadvantages are going to be huge. Because of the debt negotiation, the debt ceiling, all of that that's going on right now, it seems very likely to me that that's going to be a political hot button, that any proposal having anything to do with taxes, negatives will have a very easy job winning, that it'll be noticed, that it'll be talked about, that it'll play into political dynamics. Because this topic is loose enough that you can go a lot of different directions with it, it is still the case that negatives are going to have they're going to need to have a lot of different link options. So if this is the kind of thing that the Republicans are going to scream and yell that this is a new tax, well, what's the implication? That gives them an opportunity to draw attention. That gives them an opportunity to pull off some political wins. You also need the link going the other direction. What if the way that this is going to be interpreted is that it's very much in line with the Republican agenda? Is that going to make the Republicans and the Obama administration work together more closely? Why is that a good thing? Why is that a bad thing? That's an easy way into the debate with just about any affirmative, I think, this year. And I will add that market confidence, what investors will think about the state of the United States deficit and the debt level and so forth, that you'll need to write that one both ways as well. That if it seems as though the United States is cutting back on the incoming revenue to where there are going to be more debt ceiling showdowns coming down the pike, then you might be able to win that there could be a market panic and that would do terrible things to the economy. But you want to be able to write it the other way as well. If it looks as though the United States has found a way of collecting revenue more efficiently, it might just postpone the wake-up call that needs to happen. And you might be able to win on the negative that the longer we wait to have it, the worse it's going to be when it inevitably happens, which means short-term improvements are actually worse. And if you go digging through some of the commentary, some of the columnist literature surrounding the debt, you can find them making that argument, and you can write that disadvantage. One other thing, and I admit this is the kind of thing that we do this in debate when we're feeling playful. These aren't necessarily arguments that we think are a great idea or we would like to see carried out. But I got to thinking, there's a protest movement that's been popping its head up over the past few years talking about the need to abolish money. And they've been showing up at G20 summits, and they've been publishing their own materials, and they are a little bit flaky. But if you look for the terms gift economy, and if you look for terms like moneyless world, you can actually go, there's a website, www.gift-economy.com, and you'll find that there's an author there who says that the idea of exchange is really patriarchal in nature, and it's really about the ideal male behavior squeezing out idealized female behavior, which would be more about giving of gifts and not keeping track. And if you don't keep track of value, then you don't need money. And if you were to run either as a critique or possibly as a sweeping counterplan, getting rid of money, well, that's clearly competitive with revenue generation. It's probably competitive even with revenue generation simplification or revenue reduction. And you could win some really, really big, really systemic arguments about how it's the pursuit of money that contributes to all kinds of social evils. Now, a lot of these authors are Marxist, a lot of them make explicitly socialist claims, and you might find that your judging pool is not very receptive to them. But it's the kind of thing that you throw it out there and you see if the affirmative is prepared to answer it. And if you have a parent judge, a lay judge, and you're going to lose all your credibility by making that argument, then I wouldn't really recommend that. But if you have the kind of judge who's going to judge it on the merits and see who did the best job of answering the argument, then this is the kind of argument you could spend a little time in the summer preparing. So if you're caught completely flat-footed with an affirmative that you really don't have anything to say against and you've got the right judge, I mean, if nothing else, these are kind of fun arguments to make, the sort of good is bad type arguments. Over the years, we used to have debates over things like nuclear war. A nuclear war would be a good thing, or species extinction would be a good thing. And so one of these, abolishing money, would be a good thing. Without money, we'd all be a lot happier. Gift economy, you would also want to look for anarchist economics. There's a fair amount written by people in that vein about how, if we ever were to do away with government, how would we exchange the things that we need to survive that we can't necessarily produce ourselves. And there are some pretty creative arguments as to what would happen if we did away with money. So those are some preliminary thoughts, and as additional things occur to me, I'll come back and I'll see if I can't steer you in some directions that will get you to some interesting and fun arguments.